It's honestly one of the most drastic political transformations in modern history. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tracing the fascinating and frankly turbulent ideological evolution of Ayatollah Khomeini. We're going to look at his journey from a quiet, studious scholar to the uncompromising architect of a revolution. We'll be diving right into the specific events, his early political moves, and those long, critical years in exile that fundamentally shaped his worldview. Okay, let's get into it.
So here's the big mystery we're unpacking today. How exactly does an orphaned traditional scholar end up becoming the supreme ruler of an absolute theocracy? We're going to trace this chronologically, starting from his childhood all the way up to his radical acquisition of absolute power. It's a journey that totally reshaped the modern Middle East, and interestingly enough, it all starts with profound personal tragedy.
That brings us to Section 1, Tragedy and Early Years. Let's look at the foundational events that shaped him.
Khomeini was a survivor forged by really profound loss from the very beginning. He was born in 1902 in the town of Khomeini, and he was only 5 months old when his father, who was a local cleric, was murdered. The sources point to a dispute with the employees of an absentee landlord. Then, fast forward to 1918, a cholera epidemic sweeps through and claims the lives of both his mother and his aunt. He was left in the care of his older brother. These early, jarring encounters with arbitrary violence and sudden loss seem to have cultivated this really deep-seated distrust of unchecked elite power and socioeconomic injustice.
Moving on to Section 2, the mystical scholar. So in his young adulthood in Arak and Qom, Khomeini didn't just stick to traditional Islamic law. He actually dove deep into the spiritual realms, specifically a concept called irfan. It's essentially a form of Islamic mysticism that focuses on a spiritual, philosophical encounter with absolute truth, and this idea of the perfect man. This is a hugely important piece of the puzzle, because this mystical belief perfectly aligned with his much later political conviction, the idea that a perfectly qualified jurist could accurately and flawlessly interpret divine will for an entire nation. His intense study of irfan wasn't just some academic side quest. It literally became the hidden bedrock of his entire political ideology. He was essentially developing a unified worldview where divine law, mysticism, and eventually state governance were all totally intertwined. For Khomeini just couldn't separate the spiritual from the political.
To really understand how radical this was, you have to look at the tradition. For centuries, the standard stance of the Shia clerical establishment was quietism. Basically, the belief that the clergy should stay out of direct political rule and just wait for the return of the hidden 12th Imam. Even Khomeini's mentors believed this. But Khomeini, he totally shattered that paradigm. He argued the exact opposite, claiming that the clergy's sacred duty was actually to take over the state and actively implement divine law.
Which leads us to Section 3, the spark of rebellion. What pushed this mystical scholar into the political arena?
In the early 1960s, the Shah of Iran launched the White Revolution, which was this massive, sweeping modernization program. For Khomeini, these specific secularizing reforms were the ultimate catalyst. The reforms included land redistribution that directly targeted the financial holdings of religious institutions, and they granted voting rights to women and non-Muslims. Khomeini viewed these as direct attacks on Islam and traditional Iranian society. This is what infuriated him and drew him into open, radical opposition against the monarchy.
But the absolute final straw happened in 1964. The Iranian parliament passed a bill that granted complete diplomatic immunity to U.S. military personnel operating in Iran. Khomeini protested this fiercely. He argued that it degraded Iranian sovereignty to a totally humiliating level, famously suggesting it reduced Iranians to a status lower than an American dog. His fiery speeches against these capitulations made him a wildly popular anti-imperialist figure overnight, but it also forced the Shah's hand.
Section 4. The Laboratory of Exile. The Shah decided Khomeini was just too dangerous to keep around.
So he was exiled in November 1964. This kicked off a 14-year exile that took him from Bursa, Turkey, over to Najaf, Iraq, and finally to Paris, France. But it was this physical isolation, especially those nearly 14 years he spent in the scholarly city of Najaf, that actually gave him the space he needed. It acted as an incubator to fuse his anger at the Shah with his deep mystical training into one definitive, actionable political theory. Actually, his first stop in Turkey is pretty fascinating. According to intelligence files, Khomeini was put under super strict surveillance by the Turkish military. They forced him to abandon his traditional clerical dress for secular clothes, and ironically, they gave him the codename Belly,
which means obvious or clear in Turkish. It is just wild to think that the future supreme leader of Iran was once this heavily monitored guest, stripped of his clerical robes, quietly hidden away in a Turkish residence.
That brings us to Section 5, Guardianship of the Jurist. This is where the theory solidifies. It was during that lengthy Iraqi exile in Najaf that Khomeini developed the exact mechanism for his intended theocracy. It's a concept known as Velayat-e-Faqih. This right here is the entire ideological payload of his life's work. He argued that in the absence of the 12th Imam, a highly qualified Islamic jurist shouldn't just offer spiritual advice. No, they must hold absolute, supreme political and religious authority over the state. They become the ultimate guardian.
Now, other clerics were discussing this concept too, but Khomeini's version was entirely unique in its absolute nature. For instance, his contemporary, Ayatollah Montazeri, believed a jurist's authority was strictly constrained within the existing framework of Islamic law. But Khomeini? He believed the supreme leader's understanding of what was best for the Islamic regime was paramount. He placed the state's survival above all else, arguing the leader could even override secondary Islamic laws if it meant protecting the state. And finally, Section 6. Absolute rule realized.
In 1979, after massive protests and the total collapse of the Shah's regime, the exiled cleric finally returned to Iran, and almost immediately his theoretical framework became the unforgiving reality of the Iranian state. Once in power, that absolute authority dictated by his doctrine was systematically applied. The new government quickly suppressed the secular, liberal, and leftist factions, many of whom had actually helped overthrow the Shah in the first place. Absolute clerical rule was officially enshrined in the 1979 Constitution.
As his rule faced ongoing opposition, this absolute authority was ruthlessly applied. By 1988, facing internal unrest and the end of the grueling Iran-Iraq war, Khomeini issued a secret order. This directive created special commissions, which later became known as death committees. According to historical records and human rights reports, these committees systematically interrogated and executed thousands of imprisoned leftists and members of the MK opposition group. These were carried out in secret, completely outside of any established legal authority or proper trials. It was a stark demonstration of his unyielding ideological control.
The estimated human costs of those 1988 mass executions is truly sobering. While some opposition groups argue the number is much higher, international human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch estimate that anywhere between 2,800 to over 5,000 men, women, and teenagers were killed in a matter of months. It stands as an undeniable manifestation of his total sovereign power and the lengths the regime would go to protect its ideological purity. So, from an orphaned boy in Khomeini to a mystic scholar in Qom to a heavily monitored exile, and finally, the absolute ruler of a theocratic state, Ayatollah Khomeini's life represents an incredibly profound ideological metamorphosis. As we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a really heavy question to chew on. When a philosophy forged in the isolation of exile becomes absolute, unyielding law, who ultimately pays the price? Thanks for joining me today, and as always, keep questioning the history that shapes our world.